John, go ahead. You're on mute.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. My name is John Wentz. I am a member of the board of the Central Ohio Workers Center and also a labor attorney here in Columbus, Ohio. I am going to be moderating this webinar with my fellow board member, Samantha Trueblood. And again, thank you for joining us tonight for what is our fourth and final webinar in the Central Ohio Workers Center's Working in the Age of COVID-19 Racial and Economic Justice Project. We are very excited to present a video titled Connections, the Child Labor Reform, Labor, and Civil Rights Movements. As the title indicates, our video explores the historical connections between these great movements that brought about necessary and lasting change in the United States. We think this is a very important and timely discussion because there is a resurgent labor movement and civil rights movement in the United States today. Our excellent group of panelists will provide us with a historical and a contemporary perspective on how these movements become and became stronger when they work together and how they are bringing people together today around a common set of issues that unites all of us. The video will be followed by a panel discussion, as I indicated, and then some question and answer from webinar participants during the final 10 minutes of tonight's program. What I'd like to do now is introduce our panelists, and then I will turn this over to my co-moderator, Samantha Trueblood. We have four panelists this evening: Petey Talley, the former Secretary Treasurer of the Ohio AFL-CIO, Jocelyn Woodards, the Popular Education Coordinator at the National AFL-CIO, Andrea Canini, Field Coordinator for the Ohio Federation of Teachers, and Gavin Strassel, the Archivist for the UAW collection at Wayne State University's library. With that said, I will turn it over to Samantha Trueblood.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome. As John mentioned, I'm Samantha Trueblood. I am a senior field representative with the National AFL-CIO. I'm a board member of the Central Ohio Workers Center, and I'm also a proud member of the News Guild, Local 32035. This video that we've worked so hard on for you is about 20 minutes long, and it shows some people you may know in our local community. We've got labor leaders, we've got activists, and we've got rank and file folks who work for a living. And so I'm proud to share this project with you, and give me a moment to go ahead and share my screen. Thank you. Ellie, will you allow me to share, please? Thank you. Let me reload this. I just want to make sure that y'all are able to hear this. Okay, let's get this step.
This Central Ohio Workers Center video focuses on how many of the most important rights we have as Americans were achieved through the heroic efforts of ordinary people, students and the elderly, factory and domestic workers, miners and the unemployed, agricultural workers and clergy, to name a few. Their story is your story. It belongs to all of us. People just like you made history in their schools, in their workplaces, in their neighborhoods, and in voting booths across the United States. You can do the same when you know your rights, where those rights came from, and how to enforce them.
Hello, I'm Melissa Cropper. President of the Ohio Federation of Teachers and Secretary-Treasurer of the Ohio AFL-CIO. This Central Ohio Workers Center video highlights the rights of young workers, the right to unionize, and the right to be free of unlawful discrimination at work. In the process, we will learn about the historical connections between the movements for civil rights and labor rights, what those movements accomplished for all of us, and how you can get involved today.
State and federal labor laws protect young people who work. These laws recognize that work can be economically necessary and valuable for young people. But education, spending time with family and friends, and having fun is also important. That was not always the case. From the earliest days of the Republic, children worked in shops, fields, and in the home. In southern states where slavery existed, Black children were forced to work against their will under brutal conditions with the threat of physical punishment or death. After the Civil War, millions of young boys and girls worked in mines, factories, mills, shops, on farms, and out of their homes. The 1870 census found that 1 of every 8 children was employed. This rate increased to more than 1 in 5 children by 1900, including children under the age of 10. Wages were very low. In the textile industry, for example, adult men earned $6 to $7 a week, while children could be hired for only $2 a week. Children also worked in the Southern sharecropper system that permitted laborers to keep a small portion of what they grew, but denied them wages. In some industries, children regularly worked at night rather than sleeping. Like their parents who worked extremely long hours for little money, young people and children were taken advantage of, forced to work in unsafe conditions, and frequently were injured or even killed on the job.
Just like today, American history is full of examples of ordinary people standing up for themselves and helping one another secure rights for everyone. As far back as 1836, the National Trades Union called for a minimum age requirement for factory workers. Organizations like the National Child Labor Committee, founded by a clergyman at the beginning of the 20th century, advocated for legislation to protect children workers. Other organizations and activists were part of the movement, and young workers themselves demanded fair treatment and a better life. In 1903, at least 10,000 child laborers walked off the job during a strike at a mill in Kensington, Pennsylvania. The famous union organizer, Mary Harris Mother Jones, took up their cause and organized rallies and marches with young workers at the center, many of whom had lost fingers and others who had been horribly injured at work. It would take years of commitment, organizing, and solidarity, but eventually, state legislatures and Congress passed sweeping reform laws to protect young people in the workplace and to assure that they could attend school and develop their skills and talents as human beings.
In 1921, Ohio passed the Byng Act, requiring all children between the ages of 8 and 18, with limited exceptions, to attend school. In 1938, Congress passed the child labor law provisions of the Fair Labor Standards Act, or FLSA, a federal law that limits the hours and types of work minors can perform. The FLSA applies unless a state law provides greater protections to young workers. Under Ohio law, minors aged 13 and younger are prohibited from employment. Minors between the ages of 14 and 17 must obtain a work permit. Forms can be obtained through the Ohio Department of Commerce website. Contact your school district for more information. All workers under the age of 18 are entitled to a 30-minute rest break after 5 consecutive hours of work. Minors age 14 and 15 years old are prohibited from working before 7 a.m. or after 9 p.m. from June 1st to September 1st, or during any school holiday of 5 school days or more, or working after 7 p.m. at any other time. working for more than 3 hours a day in any school day, working for more than 18 hours in any school week, working for more than 8 hours in any day when school is not in session, and working for more than 40 hours in any week that school is not in session or during school hours, unless employment is part of a bona fide program of vocational, cooperative training, work study, or other work-oriented programs with the purpose of educating students, and the program meets standards established by the State Board of Education. Minors aged 16 and 17 years of age who are required to attend school are prohibited from working before 7 a.m. on any day that school is in session, or 6 a.m. if the person was not employed after 7 p.m. the previous night, and working after 11 p.m. on any night preceding a day that school is in session. Ohio law prohibits the employment of minors under the age of 16 in certain occupations, including cooking, baking, construction, repair, and others, as well as operating certain types of equipment and machinery. A wide range of dangerous work is prohibited for all minors under the age of 18.
It's important that all of us stand up for our rights and the rights of others in our communities. If you believe a younger worker's rights have been violated on the job, you can file a complaint with the Ohio Department of Commerce, Division of Industrial Compliance and Labor, Bureau of Wage and Hour Administration, or the United States Department of Labor, Wage and Hour Division. If you need more information or assistance, contact the Central Ohio Worker Center. We can help.
Child labor laws were and remain necessary. It took many years to win these protections, and the work of our ancestors inspires us in our own communities today. But these laws alone don't address the problem of low wages experienced by many young and adult workers. In fact, many of the same people and organizations that fought to protect children in the workplace joined and supported the labor movement. The labor movement led the struggle to win the right to form labor unions so that all working people can receive good pay and benefits and safe and respectful working conditions.
What is a labor union? A labor union is an organization of working people who join together to achieve common goals at work, such as increased pay, better benefits, health and safety protections against COVID-19, and a more equal and mutually respectful relationship with their employer. Unionized employees then engage in collective bargaining with their employer, a process that permits them to use their collective bargaining power through social media, appeals to the public, informational picketing, and even strikes to obtain a legally binding contract with their employer.
Today, the right of workers to unionize is recognized by law. That was not always the case. Like the movement for civil rights in the United States, the movement to win the right to unionize was met with intense opposition and sometimes violence that spanned the 19th and 20th centuries. In 1877, a strike by the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad workers against wage cuts unleashed what became known as the Great Upheaval. Over 100,000 workers participated in strike actions. Local and state militias were used to break the strike, and federal troops were deployed. Nearly 100 people were killed in the violence, and thousands of buildings and train cars were destroyed. In 1921, miners mobilized to unionize the southwestern West Virginia coal fields and were met by federal troops and private aircraft hired by mine owners that dropped bombs and gas.
Time and time again, ordinary working people, no different from us, young and old, white and persons of color, citizens and recent immigrants, risked and sometimes lost their jobs and even their lives to win the right to unionize. In 1934, 5 years into the Great Depression, general strikes broke out in Toledo, San Francisco, and Minneapolis as workers demanded fair pay. better working conditions, and recognition of their unions. Virtually every industry in the United States was impacted. Decades of struggle culminated in the passage of new labor laws that provide all working people with invaluable rights and protections.
The Railway Labor Act, or RLA, became law in 1926 and originally covered railroad workers only and was amended to include airline workers in 1936. The National Labor Relations Act, or NLRA, was signed into law in 1935 and covers all other private sector employees, excluding agricultural workers, independent contractors, and supervisory employees, with limited exceptions. Ohio's public sector collective bargaining law applies to Ohio government employees and was originally enacted in 1983. All three laws guarantee the right of employees to form unions and require employers to negotiate with unions that represent their employees. The NLRA not only protects the right to unionize, it also prohibits retaliation against individuals and groups of employees who complain to their employers about pay, benefits, safety and health issues, and other working conditions on behalf of coworkers. This is what's known as protected concerted activity, which is the right of employees to take collective action for their mutual aid and protection. Federal government employees also have the right to a union and bargaining rights specific to their sector. If you believe your employer has violated your rights under the National Labor Relations Act, you may want to consider filing an unfair labor practice charge against your employer with the National Labor Relations Board. Visit the NLRB's website at nlrb.gov or call 513-684-3686 and ask to speak with the Public Information Officer. As we've seen, some of our most important rights are the product of struggles dating back well over 100 years. The final portion of this video focuses on the movement for equal rights for Black Americans, with an emphasis on one of the most significant pieces of civil rights legislation ever passed in the United States, Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which prohibits discrimination in employment on the basis of race and skin color, among other characteristics.
We all have the right to live free from discrimination. The Emancipation Proclamation and the Civil War ended slavery, but discrimination against Black Americans in the North and South continued in every aspect of life: economic, political, and social. Another 100 years would pass before federal laws were enacted prohibiting discrimination based on race in employment and guaranteeing Black Americans the right to vote. During that span of time, in the face of indifference and organized violence, individuals and groups resisted discrimination. They demanded equality, dignity, and respect. They made progress against tremendous odds, but it would take a mass movement to bring about fundamental and lasting changes.
The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s was made up of courageous working people and students, supported by a wide array of churches and organizations with visionary and highly effective leadership, beginning with Rosa Parks' refusal to give up her seat on a public bus. The successful Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott from December 5th, 1955 to December 20th, 1956 is considered the first large-scale campaign against segregation. Over 40,000 Black residents boycotted the city's segregated bus system until it agreed to desegregate. The NAACP played a critical role in the campaign, and a young member of the local clergy, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., would emerge as a new and inspirational voice for change. In 1960, students from Fisk University and their supporters led the successful campaign to desegregate lunch counters in downtown Nashville, Tennessee. Despite violence against peaceful protesters and numerous arrests, the movement spread quickly across the South.
Diane Nash, a leader of the Nashville Campaign and other student activists with the support of the Southern Christian Leadership Council, formed the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in 1961. SNCC, including future Member of Congress John Lewis and the Congress for Racial Equality led by James Farmer, would organize the Multiracial Freedom Ride campaign to desegregate interstate transportation. In 1963, peaceful civil rights protesters, many of them children, were attacked by police dogs, hit with high-powered fire hoses, and arrested by the thousands in Birmingham, Alabama, in response to a campaign to desegregate the city. Dr. King would write the famous letter from Birmingham jail urging people of conscience to act against injustice. Later that year, 4 girls died in the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church. 1963 also witnessed 200,000 people participate in the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Labor unions, including the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and the United Auto Workers, provided critical financial support and played a prominent role in the march. In 1964, SCLC, SNCC, CORE, and the NAACP, led by SNCC's Bob Moses, launched the Mississippi Freedom Summer Project to register voters and organize alternative freedom schools to segregated schools. Over 700 white college students traveled to Mississippi from the North to participate in the campaign. 3 civil rights workers, 2 white students from New York, Michael Schwerner and Andrew Goodman, and James Chaney, a local Black man, were murdered after being arrested and released from jail.
In response to the strength of the movement and growing public support for change, President Lyndon Johnson signed the 1964 Civil Rights Act into law. Title VII of the Act prohibited discrimination in employment based on race and color. The new law also prohibited discrimination based on sex, religion, and national origin, and created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to investigate violations and enforce the new law. Title VII applies to employers with 15 or more employees. Federal civil rights laws also prohibit discrimination based on age and prohibit sexual orientation, disability, and veteran status discrimination. Ohio has a state civil rights law that applies to employers with 4 or more employees. The Ohio law generally prohibits discrimination for the same reasons as federal law.
Acts of illegal discrimination include, but are not limited to, not being hired, being disciplined or fired, being denied a raise or a promotion, being demoted or being harassed for a reason prohibited by a federal or state civil rights law, or being retaliated against for reporting discrimination in the workplace.
If you believe you are a victim of illegal discrimination, you can file a civil rights charge with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. You can also file a charge with the Ohio Civil Rights Commission. There are strict time limits for filing state and federal civil rights charges. Visit eeoc.gov and crc.ohio.gov for more information.
We hope you found this video informative. These essential laws were not given to us. They were earned through the sacrifices made by countless people who came before us. Some of their names may have been forgotten, but their contributions to our history and our communities live on in the movements and the organizations they built and the laws they helped bring into existence. Now it's up to us to make sure these laws are enforced, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. The Central Ohio Workers Center has made additional materials and resources available on its website at centralohioworkerscenter.org. We also want to know if you found this video to be helpful and informative. Most importantly, we want to work with you on the workplace and community issues that matter to you. Please join COWC today or register for updates so we can stay in touch. We hold monthly meetings that are free and open to the public.
Thank you. So a bit of background on our video. it was made with high school students in mind, as well as everyone interested in these important subjects in American history. We hope that you found the video interesting and informative. What we'd like to do now is transition to a discussion with our panelists to explore some of the connections that are raised in the video itself. I would like to begin with Gavin Strassel, who is the archivist at Wayne State University for the UAW collection. Gavin, two of the most towering figures in the history of the labor movement and the civil rights movement are Martin Luther King and Walter Reuther. And in the video, we see images of both of them. Both individuals had a massive impact on US history in the 20th century and world history. You're the archivist for the UAW at Wayne State. Could you share with us the connections between these two men and their organizations and how that connection translated into building a stronger civil rights movement and a stronger labor movement?
Absolutely. So answering this, I'd like to begin with who was Walter Reuther, because we all know who Martin Luther King was and what he did. But Walter Reuther was, like you said, one of the most important people of the 20th century. But today he's not as well known. But in his time, he was probably the most prominent labor leader in the country and had a great effect on American society. So he was the president of the UAW from 1946 until 1970 when he passed away suddenly. And he was known for presiding over the union when it bargained for some landmark gains that really transformed American society. This included not just higher wages, but things like pensions and guaranteed annual wages. And this had a rippling effect across the industrial sector and really raised many, many workers into the middle class and, really established the middle class as we traditionally know it. But in addition to that, he was probably, at the time, labor's champion of what we know as social unionism. So this is something that's talked about in the video that we just watched. But social unionism, for those that don't know, is when a labor union prioritizes not just getting better wages for its members, but also bringing about positive change for greater society, being a force of good in its community and beyond that. So you may think about that as advocating for environmental or conservation causes, doing work to help out immigrants and refugees. And the UAW during Walter Reuther's time and past that was involved in a number of these causes, but is best known for its work supporting the civil rights movement. And that's because Walter Reuther believed that the labor movement had a moral obligation to not just support this movement, but be at the front of it and do all that it can to push civil rights in this country. And under his leadership as president of the UAW and his work with the AFL-CIO, he became probably the biggest supporter of the civil rights movement from labor in terms of resources given. He donated a lot of money to civil rights causes, but more than that, he dedicated staff at the UAW's headquarters to work on civil rights events. Their capacity to organize was put to use for things like boycotts or voter registration drives. And he also put the UAW's political connections at the disposal of people like Martin Luther King. And for Martin Luther King, he was, this great civil rights leader, but he really believed in labor rights and workers' rights too, and would make stands against right to work, support raising the minimum wage. So Walter Reuther, when he really saw somebody that he felt connected to with Martin Luther King. And at some point in the late 50s, the UAW became a dedicated supporter to Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and other civil rights organizations. And they helped do things like bail out freedom riders in the South, fund voter registration campaigns in Black neighborhoods. And they really became seen as like one of the most dedicated and reliable supporters of the civil rights cause. And today, it's hard to imagine the civil rights movement and organized labor not working together and on a lot of different things. That it's something when one is struggling or striving for something, the other comes to its aid. But that wasn't always the case. And, it's thanks to people like Dr. Martin Luther King and Walter Reuther that that's such a strong connection today.
Thank you, Gavin.
Thank you, Gavin. The title of our webinar includes the word connections, and our video briefly touches upon the historical connections between the labor and civil rights movement. Petey and Jocelyn, let's start with you. What are the connections between the labor and civil rights movement today, and how do they inform the work you've done and are doing on the ground?
Who should go first, me or Jocelyn? Doesn't matter. Jocelyn, I'll defer to you.
Oh, I was going to defer to you. Well, thank you so much, Secretary Treasurer, Madam Secretary Treasurer. Good evening, everyone. So to talk about the connections between labor and the civil rights movement, I think it is important to just put it into historical context briefly and pick up on something that Gavin mentioned in his remarks, the connection between Walter Reuther and Dr. King. And in fact, I think it's also important to point out that Dr. King understood the connection between the civil rights movement and the labor movement so well that he essentially gave his life for the cause of organizing new unions in the South, specifically working with sanitation workers in Memphis. So this is important to point out because these connections exist all the way, obviously, up until this day. And the need to continue to work together is just as important as it was in Dr. King's day in the early 1960s. In fact, if I may, I will just talk briefly about an address that Dr. King gave in 1961 at an executive committee meeting in Florida, where he gave an eloquent speech where he said, if the Negro wins, labor wins. And he pointed out all of the parallels between the American civil rights movement at the time and the existing labor movement at the time. He talked about labor and the civil rights movement having the same enemy, which at that point, he was talking about those were the people who were promoting war, who are essentially corporate interests and corporate actors who continue to be bad actors until this day. So I think, it's hard to talk about, the connections because they're absolutely critical. The other thing that we would point out, or I would point out, is a gentleman that may not be as well known as obviously as Dr. King is A. Philip Randolph. A. Philip Randolph was one of the most important labor leaders and also a leader of the American Civil Rights Movement. A. Philip Randolph helped to organize the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. He initiated a 10-year campaign in the 1920s, and they did not win their election until 10 years later, which points out the continued need for stronger labor laws, which I'll talk about a little bit more. But I just would say that I think that the history of Dr. King points out the necessity of continued the continued interest that labor and the civil rights movement continue to have. One other thing that I would point out is this issue of income inequality, which disproportionately affects working people, people of color, folks across all economic or all backgrounds, and structural racism, all of which are enemies of the civil rights movement and the American labor movement. But let me just stop and say, I think that these joint struggles have been identified for us since the early 1960s, and we continue to have these struggles up until this day. And I could just point to some of our recent campaigns against corporate bad actors who show that we need to have stronger labor laws, because some of our labor laws have not been changed or updated since the 1930s when they were first implemented in the first place. So let me just stop there. Secretary Treasurer.
Thank you, Jocelyn. And I want to build a little bit on the history, but introduce another entity where this the world of civil rights and labor rights seem to overlap. Just drawing on that overlapping history, working with groups like the NAACP, which continue to make these very strong stance in the fight for labor rights and civil rights, and making the connection that they are in fact one of the same. And that's why we're seeing more and more community involvement when workers are fighting to get a union at their workplace. The current president of the NAACP, Derrick Johnson, just said recently, without the effort to make sure that people could effectively bargain for their labor, there would never have been a civil rights movement. And that's a pretty strong statement coming from a civil rights organization. These issues of fighting that we saw in the 1960s are still prevalent today. We're still fighting for increases in minimum wage, and that's both union and civil rights community, affordable healthcare, better quality education, housing, retirement security, and an end to voter suppression, reproductive justice. These are the connectors between a strong civil rights public policy and strong worker rights public policy. And so the connection is there, it's strong. I want to go back. I'm sorry, my dog is barking because my doorbell's. I want to just say something a little bit about how political kind of also enters into this discussion about the connection between civil rights and labor rights. In 1957, when Senator Strom Thurmond used the filibuster for 24 hours and 18 minutes to stall the first piece of federal civil rights legislation that would have empowered federal prosecutors to prevent interference with voting, kind of now brings into this other layer of the political realm of why these two movements have been so intertwined and had to have seen their trajectory often attacked by big corporate interests, but also in the political realm. 7 years later, after that 1957 filibuster by Strom Thurmond, they used the filibuster again to prevent a vote on what would have become, at that time, the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And they did that for 2 whole months until President Johnson secured enough votes that he needed in order to end the debate. And then a month later, as we know, he signed the Civil Rights Act into law, which guaranteed crucial civil rights and the right to equal employment opportunity. And so, you know, the history is important, but it's important in the context that we are still fighting today, side by side. The civil rights movement and the workers' right movement are right there side by side. And now we have the political realm to also deal with. There's been talk in this current administration about using the filibuster again to just pass legislation that would be beneficial for workers or civil rights, voting rights, and the whole 9 yards because of the way our politics are in this country. President Johnson, after he was able to get the Civil Rights Act signed into law, a year after that, he tried to do the same thing and was stopped when he was trying to secure legislation that would have prevented the states from adopting these so-called right to work laws that are prevalent on the books today. And so not being able to get that done because the political realm kind of came into play is pretty tough. But even through all of that, the civil rights and the labor rights movement have found ways to work together to really win good pieces of good secure, whether it's a union campaign, as in the Smithfield campaign in North Carolina, where the community joined with workers to win that campaign, or the Senate Bill 5 campaign that we fought in 2011 here in the state of Ohio, to when the legislators tried to repeal the public workers' right to organize. It was the community. It was a community, and many in the civil rights community, the churches, groups like the NAACP, and other groups that came together to kind of help stave off that piece of legislation. We're thinking about the Chicago Teachers Union strike, where they not only saw bargaining for better wages and working conditions for themselves as a priority, but also improving the lives of students. So these movements have always been connected. They continue to be connected both civilly as well as in the workers' rights. And unless and until we are able to push back and get good public policy like the PRO Act coming up, or other things like HR 1, you will continue to see both our movements kind of stand side by side, arm in arm, continuing to be linked until we can find justice for both of those movements.
Thank you, Petey and Jocelyn. Andrea, you represent school teachers and university faculty. You were also involved in graduate school organizing and other organizing campaigns. My sense is that the historical ties between these two movements are not necessarily widely known. Andrea, from the perspective of someone who works in education and who has been active in various social justice movements, will you share your thoughts on why it's important that all of us understand the connections between the civil rights and labor movements?
Yeah, thanks, Samantha. So as Gavin discussed, since Walter Reuther and MLK, a lot of unions have sort of shifted to practicing social unionism. And given that, I find unions to be an amazing space for civil rights organizing, because they already have an established network to mobilize members and to demand change from institutions in the community, like K-12 school districts and public universities. Let's see, I've seen this in several forms, both internally and structurally. So internally, I've seen it through member education, making demands around hiring practices and curriculum, particularly in public schools, using the grievance process to address institutionalized racism, and through the union's collective bargaining agreement with employers. To talk about internal processes first, let's see, to give a really specific example that's obviously more focused on education. I was the vice president of UAW 4121, which represents academic student employees at the University of Washington. And following the 2016 election, there was obviously a lot of organizing and concerns about what the incoming Trump administration would too. So pretty quickly, the University of Washington Union Coalition came together to call on the university to become a sanctuary campus to provide support for undocumented students, international students, basically the community at large, from any really harmful policies from the Trump administration. For our union in particular, it led pretty specifically to organizing with Iranian international students who were placed in a very precarious situation due to Trump's Muslim travel ban. So we held rallies about it, educated members on the situation, which was that Iranian international students are on student visas, so they're only allowed to work for the university. And a lot of these students were social science and humanities students, so would be teaching those classes to undergraduates. And in those disciplines, there's very little summer funding, so they would typically go home. However, that would no longer be an option without losing, basically having to throw away years of work. And if they stayed, they'd be forced into clandestine work, which furthers their precarity. So we pushed the administration to open midterm bargaining over the effects, and were able to find all of our members summer employment so that they were able to continue in the US and work safely. Thinking more structurally, another current example would be right now and across the country, there are multiple anti-trans bills passing throughout state legislatures, including in Ohio. The Ohio Federation of Teachers has been very open about being against such legislation. And the teachers that are members of our unions in particular have been following student-led organizing around these issues. And then another recent example that I wanted to touch on would be the organizing coming out of the Chicago Teachers Union and the United Teachers of Los Angeles, who both use organizing for the common good, in which they're able to use contract bargaining as an opportunity to make demands to help improve the communities at large. Chicago Teachers Union went on strike in 2019, most recently, and some of the ones that they were able to get in their contract were nurses and a social worker in every school for every day of the school day, instead of having one who's like stretched across an entire district. They're able to hire specifically to support the more than 17,000 homeless students in the district, so that there will be resources specific for those students. And then finally, Chicago Public Schools committed to $35 million annually to reduce the oversized K-12 classrooms. And there's actually an enforcement mechanism in the contract so that they can ensure that the class sizes are shrinking over time so that the students are able to have better instruction, more quality time. So I wanted to focus on a few current examples that I've seen as far as educators and young folks mobilizing to support each other. And I think, especially with organizing for the common good, there's just so much potential for like really creative and powerful work for the community.
Thank you, Andrea, for sharing those thoughts. I'd like to ask a question to Jocelyn at this point. Jocelyn, you quoted a speech that Dr. King gave. In a previous video from the Workers Center, Columbus NAACP President Nana Watson quoted Dr. King, where he said, and I'm going to read the quote, "With Selma and the voting rights bill, one era of our struggle came to a close and a new era came into being. Now our struggle is for genuine equality, which means economic equality," end quote. Folks in labor talk about the union difference in terms of the economic differences that unions can make in people's lives. And that's especially true for workers who are women and racial minorities. Could you talk about the economic difference a union can make in the life of a working person, including a female worker, a minority worker, as well as all workers, men, women, white, black, brown, young, old, and why unions remain important for all working people today?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Thank you for the question, John. I think obviously Dr. King was making the pivot from the question of the moral question of civil rights to the equally important question of economic rights. And he began organizing around, continued to organize on civil rights and economic rights and talk about the importance of both. But let me just address the question that you raised, which is the union difference. We have a study as recently as 2020, which indicates that the people who are covered by a contract in a union are have better earnings, better wages, better benefits across all demographics: men, women, African Americans, Latinos, immigrants, young workers, across all demographics. People covered by a contract or a union have better wages and better benefits. And let me just talk specifically about what some of that, or how big of a gap it is for folks who have a contract or a union versus people that don't have a contract. So for women, the difference is about 24%. So in other words, there's a 24%, wages are 24% higher for women who are covered by a contract than they are for women who are not covered by a contract. This is an absolutely critical difference for women and working people. African Americans earn about 26% more in wages and benefits when they are covered by a contract. And for Latinos, the increase is 39%. Young workers tend to earn about 19% more in wages. These are actually weekly full-time wages. So the union difference is absolutely critical and important across every demographic. And to continue to talk about what we need to do today in terms of the things that labor and organizing for civil rights have in common today is the goal of focusing on income inequality. There's a statistic that I heard so for African American families, this question of income versus wealth and how long it would take to close the gap between what people earn and what their wealth, how much wealth they have, is the structural gap is so big that it would take the average African American family about 250 years. That sounds incredible, but that is the level of structural inequality that we're talking about in terms of income and wealth. For as far as wages are concerned, again, people who are covered by a union contract are closing the gap and doing better across all indicators. So I think it continues to be important that our economic rights, I think, are the civil rights issue of 2021. And people who have economic opportunity are also people who are able to contribute to society. So when we see the level of unrest that we've seen in the streets, there is a connection between that and our failure to provide economic justice and economic opportunity across all economic and social backgrounds. Thank you, John.
Thanks, Jocelyn. We mentioned the comments of NAACP President Nana Watson. President Watson also said we still have some work to do when it comes to voting rights. And I'm sure you'll agree with her, Petey. You've worked at every level of the labor movement. You're a civil rights activist and a leader, and now you're working on voting rights issues. Is there a link between working for voting rights today and working on the economic issues that matter to working people?
Thank you for that question, Samantha. And I'm going to agree with Jocelyn that economic justice is the new civil rights movement of today, but I'm going to add to that that voting rights is also the new civil rights movement of today as well. Because in the 2020 election, we used our vote, whether it was cast early or in person or by mail on election day, because we wanted to send a signal that we were determining the future of our family, our community, and our country. Whether or not we could recover from a pandemic that sought to take, that cut into the economic security of most Americans in this country. Because of the pandemic. And then we had, the summer of unrest with the racial injustice as a result of police killing unarmed Black men. And so I would say that the link between voting rights today and economic issues is definitely, there is a link that is there. What is happening today with the movement to suppress quality votes of people who had every right in the Constitution given them to go out and cast a vote. And because the outcome was not what a certain political party thought it should be, and now they are advancing a whole bunch of voting legislation, is just wrong because people were able to exercise their power. It kind of goes back to, again, that move to quiet the civil rights and the worker rights coming together, because those two movements are very, very powerful. It does change the trajectory of this country. And so to fight on vote for voting rights today means a whole lot. Right now, there's a bill that is sitting in Congress, HR 1, for the People Act, or the John L. Lewis Act, if you will, that would expand access to the ballot box, that would reduce the influence of big money in politics. Again, economics, it's like workers versus big corporate interests in politics, and whose voice is winning out. If we're not careful, the money can trump the voice of the people. If we're not careful. The For the People Act would also strengthen ethics for public service and implement anti-corporation measures. We know that this bill has already passed the House and is sitting in the United States Senate. But we also know that currently there are over 400 voter suppression bills that are sitting in state legislatures across this country, that everyday people should have an opportunity to cast their vote, exercise their power at the political at the ballot box, but because of the people who would also silence our voice and keep the wage gap what it is, keep power concentrated at the top. From an economic standpoint, those same people are silent when it comes to making sure that we have full and fair representation in voting. So Nana is absolutely right. We have a lot of work to do around voting rights and the work that has to be done. We have to form coalitions, again, with community and unions and workers all coming together. We did that once again in 2011 when we were fighting against Senate Bill 5 in Ohio. And I bring reference to that because it was a workers' bill, but workers then quickly joined the civil rights community to tamp down HB 694 or 894. I can't remember the number right now. I have to get that before we go off the air today, to push back on a voter suppression bill that was coming. And the messaging that we used for that particular campaign was simply that if voters can't go to the polls because their vote has been suppressed, how will we be able to repeal Senate Bill 5 that is going to give workers their voice in the collective bargaining process? So again, as early as 2011, worker rights, civil rights, still two movements, one goal, trying to make sure that we have our voice in both economically as well as in the ballot box.
Thank you, Petey. So we have about 22 minutes left on the schedule, and I know Sam and I both have a number of questions that we still want to pose. And we're going to move forward and try to keep about 5 to 10 minutes left at the end. So on the remainder, we'll ask our questions quickly, and maybe if we shoot for, what do you think, Sam? 3-minute responses, we can get them all in, because we have so many questions we want to pose to our excellent panel. Let me turn back to Gavin now. Gavin, the UAW was part of a broad movement to organize industrial workers, including Black workers who had migrated from the South to cities in the North where manufacturing jobs were available. And in the face of race discrimination in those plants and in those factories, union contracts introduced the concept of pay and promotion based on seniority rather than who you are or where you came from or who you know or what the color of your skin was. Can you talk about some of the shop floor and bargaining table strategies that the UAW used to pursue the fight against racial discrimination, and also the role that Walter Reuther and the organization played in lobbying Congress and the president to pass Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act?
Sure. Well, you know, from the UAW's earliest years, they had a very clear no discrimination clause in their constitution, which they attempted to enforce at every level of the union, from the international offices to the many locals across the country. They also, some locals were able to negotiate in the 40s and 50s non-discrimination clauses in their contracts with specific plants. They found some success with that, but they weren't able to replicate that across the country. The UAW and other labor unions also worked with employers to better integrate their factories, not just getting people of color and women on the assembly line, but also opening up jobs that maybe they're less dangerous or higher paying that were exclusively for white male workers, opening those up to people of color and other minority groups. And they also utilized something called Fair Employment Practice Committees, which were kind of like a prototype of that concept that was introduced in the video, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And that was something that they really pushed for, but then for a number of years, it's a big part of their platform. But then after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, it was made obsolete. And really in that, the Civil Rights Act was so important because you can only get so much done in terms of equality in the workplace through, bargaining and advocacy. And they really, they realized that strong federal legislation was needed to deal with this issue of discrimination in the workplace. And the UAW, there's a whole story behind this, but they worked tirelessly to lobby and promote and push for the passage of the bill that would become the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and to push it, so that it was more effective and that it had actual teeth compared to previous civil rights bills that really they had some significant holes. And the Civil Rights Act wasn't perfect, but it was a really important first step. And once that was passed, Title VII really transformed things for the UAW. And really made dealing with racism and things like that in the workplace much easier, because you can try to appeal to an employer's sense of what's right or wrong. But if you say, hey, we got the federal government behind us, you can be a lot more effective that way.
Thank you, Gavin. Just a reminder to our audience members that if you have questions for our panelists, you can go ahead and pop them into the chat and we will get to them at the end of the program. Today, there is a renewed focus on civil rights, Andrea, and support for unions among working people of all races, genders, and political parties are at historic levels. As a field coordinator for OFT, you spend a good deal of your time in contract negotiations. Will you discuss what goes into negotiating a good union contract in terms of mobilizing members and building connections between people in their workplace, and how working people can find their individual and collective voices through that process?
Yeah. First of all, I think it's important to recognize that with all contract negotiations, it's rarely an issue of management's lacking the means to meet the members' demands, and it's always a matter of will. So given that, it's really important that contract campaigns begin months before negotiations, which means tons of one-on-one conversations with as many people and hopefully all of the members as many times as possible, specifically around, the workplace issues, what they think their ideal workplace would look like, what the solutions would be, as well as raising their expectations about what would be possible to win through a contract. I think ideally this happens through having a supermajority of membership participation. So like regularly having actions like member surveys, demand letters, and just different opportunities for members to participate and express their needs in the workplace sort of continually and regularly throughout the campaign. And the only way you're going to do this is by mobilizing around issues that matter to workers. So if the workers, for example, don't have a living wage, it's going to be hard for them to pay for rent to work where they live. And inevitably, that's going to lead to, especially at like higher education, that's going to lead to further pipeline issues around who has access to education. So thinking about folks of different genders, different racial backgrounds and ethnic backgrounds, and then whose voice is represented. And sort of returning to the idea of Jane McAlevey calls them structure tests. So just like lots of different opportunities for the rank and file members to participate in the campaign provides an opportunity to find natural leaders that you might not otherwise, who might not otherwise be engaged in union work or see it as something that is relevant to them or inclusive of them. And it also provides a way to continue to develop those relationships and networks between the members so that if something does happen and you need to like quickly escalate your action, you already know how invested people are in particular issues and able to reach out to them quickly. I think another important part is educating the members, one about the process so that they can, especially preparing folks for how management will likely respond and pressure members to accept something that is less than ideal, so that they can see the long-term vision and just learn about the process and be able to engage in it. I found also that educating members about others' experiences in the workplace is really important, especially at large places like universities, where there's really an imbalance in the workplace, depending on your supervisor and frankly, your positionality. For example, some folks might have a really great supervisor and like think that like you don't need to address sexual harassment or racial inequity within a department or a workplace. But that's not always it's never always going to be the case. And everyone's always one bad boss away from having a hostile working environment. So just being able to share their coworkers' lived experiences and help create a larger narrative from a structural level as to what's going on, so people can really empathize and be there for each other. And I guess just the last thing I wanted to add is just I've always found that understanding labor and civil rights history, especially for those particular whatever particular industry you're in or local, is always really important to contextualize how long and hard fought many of the wins are, so that people can sustain their energy for what usually is going to be a long fight. And that I have seen new leaders emerge out of contract campaigns regularly, just by having so many different opportunities for them to engage. And it's always really great to see them holding management accountable and bringing new folks in.
Thank you. I'm going to take a question from the audience. Samantha Searles, great name, Samantha, from Cincinnati asks, Ms. Woodards mentioned that some of the historical labor laws need updated. Can you share an example? And this question is for everybody on the panel, if you have any thoughts to chime in. And after this, we'll return to the questions we already had arranged.
Okay, so I think that the labor laws that we talked about, or even were discussed in the video, some of these laws that we currently operate under go back to the 1920s and the 1930s, and they're old and antiquated, ineffective, and they lead to extraordinarily long, drawn out organizing campaigns. Many times the remedies are essentially toothless. So what we're doing is advocating for labor law reform by passing something called the PRO Act. The PRO Act would be the most significant labor law reform since the 1930s. And essentially what PRO Act means, protect the right to organize. So I will just say briefly about a recent organizing campaign that I was involved in, just not even really on the fringes, the organizing campaign of a warehouse, an Amazon warehouse of 6,000 workers just outside of Birmingham, Alabama. And the importance of working people understanding the connections between labor and the civil rights movement, and understanding the role that unions play in helping to create this thing that we often talk about in the labor movement called workplace democracy, which I would argue is even more important in today's political environment post January 6th. The idea of democracy at the workplace and democracy in the United States in general, I think, is more important than it has been in quite some time. So what we want to do is to strengthen our labor laws and make it less difficult for people to organize new unions and strengthen the laws that were designed to protect workers and enable them to form the right or form a union.
Thanks, Jocelyn. And while I have you, the membership of organized labor is quite diverse. Based on 2020 data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, Black workers are more likely to be unionized than white, Asian, or Hispanic workers. Men are more likely to be unionized than women, but only by 0.5%. Will you talk about what the labor movement of the 21st century looks like and how that plays into organizing new workers and building a movement of working people that puts civil rights and labor movement values into practice?
Yes, thank you, Samantha. Well, hopefully the labor movement of the 21st century looks more people of color. It looks like more people of color and more women. It looks increasingly diverse, and hopefully we will continue to encourage young people to get involved and join unions and understand the importance of these economic issues at the workplace and how they translate into society as a whole. Again, the idea of workplace democracy or having a say at work is so critical in today's political environment, I think it's hard to overstate. I think the 21st century labor movement has to be led by people of color and women. We're going to talk about women who are still seeking to make inroads into non-traditional careers, into things like the skilled trades and the construction and building trades, some of the industrial occupations. More women, more people of color, younger people, and people who understand the connection between economic rights and the struggle for maintaining or creating a more perfect democracy.
Thank you, Jocelyn. I'd like to ask the last question of the webinar to Petey Talley. And I think this might bring together a lot of what we've been discussing tonight. Petey, you've played a leadership role in so many organizations, the Coalition of Labor Union Women, the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists. Under the AFL-CIO banner, there are a number of organizations that focus on civil rights issues and issues that are of particular concern to groups of workers. Pride at Work, for example, was organized and recognized by the AFL-CIO to support LGBT workers. The A. Philip Randolph Institute organizes around racial equality and economic justice. The Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance organizes around issues of concern to Asian and Pacific Islander workers. The Labor Council on Latin American Advancement represents the interest of Latin workers in the labor movement. And we see similar organizations and caucuses within unions themselves. So can you talk about why these organizations are important and why labor continues to do internal organizing around these civil rights issues, and at the same time work so hard to find ways to bring all working people in the United States together, regardless of race, regardless of gender, regardless of national origin, to build a big, powerful coalition around these common issues that unite all of us?
Great. Yeah, great question, Jonathan. Thank you for that. The constituency groups that Jonathan mentioned are funded in part by the AFL-CIO, and they come together as voter registration and mobilization bodies, and they conduct research, they host trainings, educational conferences, issue research reports and publications. These groups lobby for legislation and build coalitions with local groups outside of themselves. As Jocelyn mentioned in the previous question, the labor movement is a more diverse labor movement. It is, the base of labor is, or the membership of labor, I should say, are people of color and women and Asian Pacific Islander leaders and workers and Latin American workers and LGBTQ workers. However, the face of labor is often still white male, white men. And so when we're trying to do an organizing campaign where the majority of workers, as Jocelyn mentioned, she gave reference to the Amazon campaign, those 6,000 plus workers, the majority of those workers were Black, right? If they would have sent in the traditional leadership of labor, they would have been faced with mostly male, mostly, white male organizers, perhaps. But a lot of unions have recognized that if we want to get more people in our unions, we have to make sure that the leadership or the face of the union is reflective of the workers that we're trying to organize. And these groups serve as bridges. They are workers, they are union workers. Some of them are leaders in their union, but they have these organizations that can, quote unquote, speak the language of or understand the cultural environment that these workers come from. And so they serve as a value to the overall labor movement to bring these workers into the House of Labor. And then we can have our great big happy family of all workers. We are not operating with our father's union of the 1930s. This is not our grandfather's union. This is a brand new labor movement where the majority of workers don't look like the workers of 1930s. And so, but our leadership in labor has not caught up to that reality yet. Our leadership still looks kind of like our grandfather's union. And so these groups serve as a bridge, so to speak, to the communities that would be in unions if we could get them organized. And it is so important to have the right look when you're trying to organize workers into this movement, to have the right look, have more women organizers, have more people of color organizers who are organizing these workers that would be in a union if it were not for the bad laws that Jocelyn also referred to that are currently on the books. And so the constituency groups are invaluable to the labor movement. We hope that they continue to understand that and continue to give them a space to lead inside of the labor movement, because I think they can help grow the labor movement where we've been stagnant for a little bit of time now. I hope that answers the question, Jonathan.
Very much so. Thank you very much, Petey. So with 1 minute left, I would like to thank my co-moderator, Samantha Trueblood, as well as our excellent panelists. I think this was an incredible discussion tonight. I hope all of the participants agree with me. This is our fourth and final webinar in this series. So I'd like to take just the last minute to thank some people who participated in our videos and supported this project. We certainly couldn't do it without them. There were a lot of people, and I'm going to leave probably some people off the list, so I apologize in advance. I'd like to start with Columbus City Council President Pro Tem Elizabeth Brown, who braved the cold during the winter to appear outside and be filmed in a video where she discussed the critical resources that were made available to Columbus residents during the pandemic. I'd also like to thank City Council member Rob Dorans. Council member Dorans supported this project from the beginning to the end. We could not have done it without him. He's a member of the IBEW and a true friend of workers in this city, and we're very grateful for his support. Numerous leaders from the labor movement and community partners participated in this project and appeared in our videos. OFT President and Ohio AFL-CIO Secretary Treasurer Melissa Cropper was in our video tonight, and Melissa was really had the idea for this particular segment, which looked at labor history and civil rights history with an idea that this is a part of American history that more people need to know about. This is something that more people need to learn about in high school. And we put this project together based largely on Melissa's idea, and we're very grateful for her support. Mark Fluharty, the Executive Director of the Central Ohio Labor Council, is always with the Central Ohio Workers Center. He's a very supportive friend, and Mark's doing great work in the community every day, and we're just grateful for the partnership. I'd also like to thank CEO of the Ohio Nurses Association, Lisa Oakes. Lisa appeared in one of our videos and was also very supportive of the project. Dorsey Hager, the Executive Secretary of the Central Ohio Columbus Building and Construction Trades Council, appeared in the video and is a strong supporter of the Workers Center. Dorsey is on the leading edge of a very successful pre-apprenticeship program, the Building Futures program here in Central Ohio, which is bringing women and racial minorities into the construction trades and prioritizing that in our community with great success. Rick Lucas, the president of the Ohio State University Nurses Organization, participated in a video. Chris Nagley, the business rep and organizer for IUPAT District Council 6, is a member of the board of the Workers Center and was in one of our videos. President of Columbus NAACP, Nana Watson, agreed to participate in our videos, and we were very happy about that. Leland Bass, the Columbus Urban League Building Futures Program Manager, who works closely with the Columbus Building Trades, gave us some of his time and also appeared in the video. Hannah Halbert, who is a board member at the Workers Center and the executive director of Ohio Policy Matters, helped to make this project possible in every way. We couldn't do it without Hannah. Ebony Davis, a success story from the Building Futures program, appeared in one of the videos and is now a proud union member. Petey Talley, I have to thank personally, who agreed to narrate all 4 of our videos and did such an excellent job for us, and we couldn't be more thankful. Anthony Timperman and the folks at Up Creative for the good work they did filming and producing the videos. Allie Smith, our excellent communications coordinator at the Workers Center, just did a ton of work behind the scenes and always does, and we appreciate it. My colleague, as a fellow union lawyer, Sarah Ingalls, who is also the president of the Workers Center, was indispensable, as were all of the other board members and members who supported this project. Last, we want to thank Wayne State University's library for making so many photographs available, which we used in tonight's video. And again, all of our panelists, thank you for your help and your support. Visit our website, visit our Facebook page, follow us on Twitter. We hope you can become more involved in the Workers Center and continue to support projects like this. These videos are going to be circulating on social media. We'll be doing community events post-pandemic. There's a lot more great work to be done. I think we can leave tonight knowing that there are great people in the civil rights movement and in the labor movement and in our community working for big, important things to make our society a better place. And after tonight, I think we have a reason to be optimistic. Thank you and have a good evening.